Hi guys, thank you everybody for coming along to our session today on changing attitudes towards disability. Welcome to everybody on Zoom as well. It's great to have you join us virtually. So today we're looking at we're sharing the results of a project that we've been working on about changing attitudes towards disability, looking at a particular case study. And so the case study that we're looking at is Perspective Shift Series 2 for this particular project. The Attitude Foundation has actually also produced Perspective Shift Series 1, that was in 2019. So the top 3 images there are of the 3 people who participated in the first series. So we have Prue Stevenson, who's an artist, Yana Costella, who is a dancer, and Daniel Monks, who is an actor, screenwriter, playwright. So in Series 1, the focus was on people in the arts, and Series 2, which is the series that we will be sharing with you today, looks at 3 people working in STEM. So we have Jackie, Oliver, and Kenny. And so we'll start off with Katie Ellis, who will present the context and provide an introduction to what the project's about, and then Chloe will be talking about the kind of textual analysis. So we're looking at different parts of how the project came together. And we've got Jordan, who will be talking about the different interviews and the focus groups. And some of you participated in focus groups. Thank you for coming along to those. And then we'll be back to Katie, and then we'll take questions. So I will start off by handing over to Katie.
Okay, so hi everyone. Thanks for coming this morning to our first ACAT morning tea. So I thought I'd start by talking about the research team and who we are. So you know me, I'm Katie Ellis. I was the chief investigator on this project. The Attitude Foundation actually came and approached me about doing this project, and Denise Wood worked with me as the chief investigator on the project, organising everything. And because this was the second time we were doing a project with the Attitude Foundation, I wanted to involve some students in the project this time. So Denise was also a supervisor for our undergraduate and honours students on the project. Dr. Leanne McRae, she did our ethics and all the policy analysis around this research. Jordan Fife, a lot of you know Jordan. She was our lead researcher, the person who spoke to everyone, basically, kept the project moving. Chloe Rattray, our honours student. This is the first time we've included an honours student on a research project, and it's, from my point of view, been a really awesome experience to get that perspective too. And Robin Lambert, who's also not here today, she did an undergraduate project on this research, where she looked at people with disability in STEM and the kind of research discussions taking place in social media around that, because that was something the Attitude Foundation were really interested in finding out more about too. So the origins of the project, I'm sort of tracing back to a conference we held here at Curtin in 2018 that some of you might have come to. It was called Disability Media and Human Rights Policy Practice and Performance, and this was coming at the end of my DECRA, where we got together a bunch of people with disabilities, disability activists, artists with disabilities, people working in the media, and talked about the media as being a human right for people with disabilities. So we looked at access to the media as one aspect of human right, representation in the media, and we also looked a bit at employment, so avenues for employment within the media for people with disabilities. The Attitude Foundation actually came to this conference, and that they participated in the discussion there, and they were also interviewed for a MOOC that we developed following that conference about disability, digital disability and media. And so following that, they came to us and asked us to be involved in evaluating some of their productions. So the Attitude Foundation that are established in 2014 in Australia, and their goal was to shape a new understanding of disability in Australia And they wanted to do this through the documentary medium. So what they did was they commissioned a documentary series that Denise introduced us to, Perspective Shift. And their goal was to feature people with disabilities telling their own stories in their own ways, because that is something they saw as being a big gap in the Australian media landscape, that people with disabilities had their stories told for them, or they were constantly represented in particular ways. So they started this with Perspective Shift Series 1, which did air in 2019 on SBS television and on SBS On Demand, and I believe it's still available on demand. And they focused on people with disability in the arts in that first series. So they identified some people with disabilities in the arts who they saw as being both leaders in the arts but also disability leaders, and invited them to tell their stories in their own way. And then they got further funding and decided to do a second series of Perspective Shift, which is what we'll talk about here today. And that series focused on STEM. So before we go any further, and Chloe's going to talk a bit more about these ideas as well, probably Jordan will too, these ways of understanding disability are really essential to this documentary series and also to our project around it and to all of the other work that we do in this research team as well. So we've identified 3 models of disability that we felt were important for this project. The first one's the medical model of disability, and this is the model, you know, we're all probably most familiar with, where we have sort of a cause-effect relationship here, where there's a disability that's caused by an impairment in the body, and that disability should be treated medically in order to be able to live with a disability. So in this way, disability is understood as a medical problem that should be solved through medical means. The social model of disability is a way of understanding disability that's in direct contrast to the medical model. And the social model looks at the way social structures create disability and how, you know, we can alleviate the effects of disability by changing the social environment around it. So we can see that the causes go the different ways. So social structures cause disability. An example of this is stairs. So I often in my talks show a picture of a guy in a wheelchair at the bottom of the stairs to illustrate that is not the guy in the wheelchair's disability causing the problem, it's the stairs and the absence of a ramp, and that is what the social model of disability explains. And we see this in media as well. So say, for example, someone needs closed captions or audio description to access television because they're either deaf or blind. And if those are not made available, that is the disability, not the person's vision or hearing impairment. And when Jordan started working with us, she introduced us to a new model of disability that we hadn't done much work in until Jordan joined the team, and that's the affirmative model of disability. And this brings disability pride into the discussion, but also looks at the way, you know, society, disability is caused by society. There are also medical issues related to disability that need to be considered, and that impairments do have an effect on the way people live their lives, and that these are not inherently negative things, and that people with disabilities bring value and valuable experiences to the table and things that we can learn from. So when we first evaluated Series 1 of Perspective Shift, we really looked at whether that documentary series followed a social model of disability or did it follow a medical model of disability, and we made comments around that issue. But in this particular evaluation of Series 2, we started looking at the affirmative model of disability and whether these documentaries were making some comments around disability pride and the kinds of unique experiences and innovations people with disabilities can bring to work environments. So Attitude Foundation asked us to use the theory of change when we evaluated this particular documentary series. So in order to do that, we needed to identify what change the Attitude Foundation wanted to make and the activity that they thought would create this change. And so these dots up here are all the different little micro steps or activities that take place in between their main activity, which is to make a documentary about disability, people with disabilities telling their own stories in their own way, to the outcome here, which is changing people's views about disability. And in order to use theory of change, you need to create these kinds of maps. And this is the map that Jordan created at the beginning of the project, where we knew there'd be a lot of micro steps and different assumptions along the way, but we didn't know what they would be yet. So we knew that it wasn't a linear line from a documentary to attitude change, and a whole lot of other stuff would need to happen along the way. So that is what we looked at in the project. So the approach we took to doing this is we wanted to look at production, the text and the reception of that text. So we talked to the people who were involved in the production of the documentary, what aims they had, how they saw social change taking place. We looked at the texts themselves, the kinds of models of disabilities, representations of disabilities that were evident within the 3 episodes, which we're not actually able to show you any of today because Attitude are still in negotiations about where and how this will be broadcast. So this is a bit of a teaser for you. When it comes out, I'll let you know where you can track it down. And then we also talked to some focus group audiences about what they thought of the kinds of storylines about disability and the ways people with disabilities represented themselves, the kind of comments they were making. And I believe a few of you participated in those focus groups, so thank you for that. Without you, the project would not have been what it was in the end. And in addition to this, we looked at a bunch of things around the making of the documentary, so policy documents that Attitude Foundation wrote, submitted to the Royal Commission into Violence and Abuse of Neglect of People with Disabilities taking place right now. And as I said earlier, Robin Lambert looked at the social media discussion of related issues around people with disabilities trying to get into STEM industries. So I'm going to hand over to Chloe now to talk about the textual analysis that she did.
Thanks. Okay, hi everyone. So as part of the project, as Katie said, we conducted a textual analysis of Series 2. So I'm going to take you through the 3 episodes because we can't show you them. I'm just going to have to give you some really vivid descriptions. And then I'll also talk about the presence of secondary participants in the series, some of the tropes and stereotypes that were present, as well as the social and medical model of disability and the representation of diversity as well. So in episode 1, we're introduced to Professor Jackie Leach-Scully. She's a professor of bioethics and the director of the Disability Innovation Institute at UNSW. Jackie became deaf at the age of 8 after contracting meningitis. She's a mixed-race woman in a same-gender relationship, and her mother also had a disability. This really impacted Jackie's preconceptions around disability as she grew up, because her mum was not comfortable in her disability. She would hide it a lot and really minimise her needs, so that kind of impacted Jackie's way of viewing her own disability as she grew up. And then overall through the episode, Jackie's represented as highly intelligent, really well-rounded and quietly confident. So each episode in Perspective Shift follows a pretty chronological kind of sequence. So Jackie first begins by describing her school environment, which was overall really supportive. Her teachers and her peers were both really supportive of her development and could see that academic potential in her. However, when she entered the workforce, she began to experience ableism from her colleagues who would say things like they found her needs too difficult to cope with. And Jackie says that this really impacted kind of how she went about interacting with people. She would really minimise her disability or just pretend that she didn't have a disability, which then kind of had a carryover effect into her work and life in general. Jackie's episode does a really good job of focusing on the social barriers that Jackie faced. So, for example, she wasn't taught sign language as a child, which made communication really difficult. When she moved to Switzerland, she couldn't lip read anymore, as well as she could in English, so that was really tough, as well as the different accessibility options on TV. As Katie mentioned before, she could no longer access those forms of media. Something that the series does really effectively is explain how these external barriers and attitudes can become really internalised and affect the kind of self-image and self-worth of people with disabilities. In Jackie's case, it really impacted her ability to build relationships, particularly with her partner Monica, who is an orchestra conductor and a music teacher. So Jackie was like really worried that she wouldn't be able to make that kind of deep connection with Monica, but she was wrong. They have a wonderful relationship. And the secondary participants in Jackie's episode are her partner Monica, her former teacher, and her industry peer. So I'll talk a little bit more about secondary participants a bit later. So towards the end of the episode, Jackie talks about how as she grew older and matured, she started to embrace her disability as part of her identity, which greatly improved her self-image and her ability to build relationships with others. She now describes her deafness as a gain rather than a hearing loss. And she's shown living a really full and desirable life. There are lots of shots of her cooking in the kitchen with Monica or doing activities like going out on hikes. And she explicitly describes how she's just like really proud of the life that she's built for herself because of, not in spite of, her disability. She also talks about the importance of disability in her field, which is bioethics. And then overall, her episode ends on a hopeful note where she says that she can see attitudes towards disability changing for the better. So in episode 2, we're introduced to Oliver. He is a graphic designer and animator who now works in the virtual reality tech startup space. Oliver was born with cerebral palsy and he's represented as community-focused, really resilient and creative. Unlike Jackie, Oliver experienced a really negative schooling environment. His parents were his greatest advocates in getting him into mainstream schools in the first place. But then once he got there, he experienced discrimination from both teachers and students. However, he says that he feels really lucky to have found support outside of school. He was really heavily involved in Scouts and other community kind of volunteering activities. When Oliver talks about finding work, he describes the difficulty that he faced, particularly around the kind of double bind wherein if he disclosed his disability on his resume, he would get no calls. And if he didn't disclose it, he would make it to the interview, but then not make it past that stage. However, he finally landed a role, and that was as an online game developer for The Wiggles, which I thought was very cool. And now he worked across various roles in web design and animation. He went back to uni to learn animation and then started his own company and won heaps of awards and stuff. And then he started working for a medical innovation company which uses virtual reality technology to improve rehab therapy for patients. One thing to note is that Oliver's post-university life is really, really heavily work-related, especially compared to his childhood, which is really kind of social and community-based. The secondary participants in Oliver's episode are his parents, his colleague, and his business partner. And his episode also ends on a really hopeful note where he speaks really directly about how he hopes to personally change people's attitudes by speaking to as many people as possible as an advocate. And then lastly, we have Kenny Singh. Kenny is a computer scientist who was born in India and moved to New Zealand as a teenager and then later to Australia as an adult. When he was a young adult or late teen, he developed retinitis pigmentosa, which causes loss of vision. Kenny's episode features really strong themes of identity and changing identity, so like moving countries, developing disability, and also sort of changing career paths. He had always wanted to be, I think, a doctor or a surgeon, but then upon developing his disability, he kind of had to change paths. Kenny's represented as really family-oriented and also highly intelligent. Kenny really effectively describes the preconceptions around disability that he had growing up in India and how these are similar and different to the preconceptions as a teenager in New Zealand. And how these, similarly to the other participants, became internalised and affected his kind of personality, the way he engaged with other people, and his kind of feelings of self-value. A huge issue for Kenny was his lack of accessibility. He'd always been really academic, but he started to really struggle with his study and then later with his work as well. However, he was really well supported by his family. Before he had screen reading technology available to him, his mum would read all his textbooks for him so that he could study for his exams. So his secondary participants are his parents, his wife, and his colleague. A huge highlight of his episode is the importance of accessibility. So Kenny's first workplace was at Vision Australia, which, as you can imagine, was really supportive of his disability and his needs around accessibility. So he felt really supported in that environment, but then when he moved jobs to a more inaccessible workplace, he kind of realised how stark the difference was and started to experience real struggles in the workplace, and would take a lot of work home with him to get his wife to help with, and it just kind of ended up in burnout. But this kind of importance of accessibility in his life inspired him to develop his own accessible software as his kind of area of expertise, and that really helped him to embrace his disability and become a proud disability role model. So in terms of the role of secondary voices throughout the series, as Katie said, one of the kind of main focuses of the series was getting the key participants to tell their own story. And they're successful in doing that throughout Perspective Shift. There's also no narrator or interviewer, which kind of allows more screen time for the key participant to talk about whatever they want. However, there are at least 3 secondary participants interviewed for each episode, sometimes more. So while that can kind of provide an insightful perspective from an outsider's point of view, especially around like childhood, where you might not remember much about what happened, or in cases like Jackie, she was quite like quiet and modest about her achievements, so other people were like really talking her up about how amazing she is. So that can be really useful. But the heavy use of secondary voices has to be considered really carefully to make sure that the purpose of their presence isn't to sort of justify the achievements of a person with a disability from the, quote, authority of someone without a disability. In terms of the models of disability represented in Perspective Shift, the series does a really effective job at demonstrating the social model of disability. There's a huge focus on the societal barriers that they face, like accessibility and discrimination from others. Any kind of descriptions of medical diagnosis is kept pretty brief, just like the need to know details, and then it moves on to their sort of life story and the other barriers that they've faced. As I mentioned before, the series is really effective in describing how those external barriers can become really internalised and the really strong impact that can have on mental health. And the episodes begin to lean towards an affirmation model of disability. There are lots of themes of disability pride, embracing of disabled identity, and being like a proud, open advocate. In terms of some of the tropes that are present in the series, Perspective Shift generally veers away from inspiration porn, where people with disabilities are just shown doing kind of ordinary things, and that's apparently really inspirational for the non-disabled people watching. So it veers away from that, as well as from themes of tragedy and pity, which are often really common in media. So that was good, but one of the tropes that is still present is the supergroup trope, and that's where someone with a disability kind of has to be like show a superhuman ability, like super intelligence, to sort of be respectable or kind of able to be shown in media. So that is still present in Perspective Shift. All of the participants are really, really high achieving individuals. And while it is really important to see people who look like you or experience the same kind of life experiences as you achieving really amazing things, it may contribute to tropes such as the supergroup trope, where it sets unattainable expectations for people with disability or for people without disabilities watching the show. Another thing that I think Jordan might touch on later is the introduction sequence where the like theme music plays and the title shows up. It's like really mysterious and melancholy and like gloomy and dark, and it has like all these jagged pictures kind of coming together to form one image. So it seems kind of out of place in this show, which is a lot more like hopeful and uplifting. So yeah, just something to note. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about the representation of diversity in Series 2. So Series 2 greatly improves upon the diversity of race represented in the show. So in Series 1, there were no people of colour represented, whereas in Series 2 we have Jackie, who's mixed race, and Kenny, who's from India. The series also continues its queer representation, with Jackie's relationship a really strong focus of her episode. In terms of the kinds of disability represented, Oliver was born with his disability, whereas Jackie and Kenny both developed their disabilities in childhood or early adulthood. And similarly, Oliver has a very kind of visible physical disability. And while Jackie and Kenny obviously still experience a lot of discrimination, as detailed in their episodes, Oliver faces really distinct discrimination based solely on his appearance. And that's definitely shown throughout his experience finding work in his episode. So yeah, in the future it would be great. I know they only have like 3 participants per series, so they can't show everything. But in future series, it would be great for them to continue that representation of different kinds of disabilities and experiences. Similarly, all participants worked in a disability-related field. And while obviously their life experiences lend really well to that, it would also be great in future series to see people with disability working in all kinds of fields to sort of show that disability is valuable in all kinds of areas. And then lastly, as I touched on before, everybody in Perspective Shift is really, really high achieving, like top of their field kind of thing. So I think that is kind of the key focus of Perspective Shift as a series. But in general in media, it would be great to see some diverse representations of disability that include some kind of more average people just living their lives. So now I'll pass over to Jordan, who will talk about the interviews and focus groups that we conducted.
Hello, I'm Jordan. So I conducted the interviews and the focus groups for this series, for this particular report. So we interviewed 2 of the key representatives from Attitude Foundation, 1 producer from Taste Creative, 2 of the talent that were represented in season 2, as well as 2 of the evaluators from Curtin University. So through these interviews, we developed some themes. So the things that were consistently talked about were the production goals, the audience, the talent, navigating inspiration porn, employment opportunities, platforms, and the consistency of communication. So navigating inspiration porn was a really big focus of these interviews. So I'm going to really touch on that. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of an example of what inspiration porn is, although you've already touched on that a little bit. But we've got inspiration porn is a cliche that is often used to represent people with disability. It's when people with disability who have otherwise ordinary lives are considered extraordinary because of their disability. And we've got an example here. So the only disability in life is a bad attitude. And it's a girl who is running and she has prosthetics, but she seems to just be running, having a good time. And the purpose of this is to inspire people who are without a disability by using people with a disability as objects of inspiration porn. So, navigating inspiration porn, the production team really talked about this a lot. So it's a really fine line because you want to have a series that isn't entertaining, and inspirational people are entertaining. So it's really hard to find that line between inspirational people that will sell a documentary and not falling into inspirational porn cliches. So there was a quote that it's literally been a creative struggle. So to navigate this inspiration porn, they tried to use voice and ownership. So they made sure that the talent felt that their stories were told by themselves and that they had ownership over these stories. And it was reported from the talent that they felt that they were listened to and that they really did have ownership over their stories. And then also we found that they were all very high achieving people. We'll touch on that more in the focus groups. But there is this concern that inspirational narratives limit the diversity of media representation and create an expectation of high achieving people. And I really liked this quote. It says, "It makes people feel as if they don't have to do anything very much because these superheroes will come along and succeed irrespective." So, onto the focus groups. So it was really interesting to interview those people because we already had quite a lot of information from Attitude Foundation, but to interview the producer and also the evaluators, especially the talent, it was really interesting to get those insights from kind of behind the scenes about what happened. And then we took those interviews and led the focus groups questions kind of based on what we derived from the interviews. So the focus groups, we carried out focus groups about Series 1 as well, because we didn't get to carry them out last year because of coronavirus. So we did that this year as well. And we found generally that Series 1 was described as carefully neutral. So there wasn't a lot of diversity and they really eased you into everything. And whereas Series 2, people felt a little bit more connected deeply because of the diversity and the intersectionality that was represented. So we've got some interesting statistic about our focus groups. We had 24 participants. 20% of them identified as having disability, which is really good because that's the same percentage of the population of Australia. So it's really good to have that same percentage. 62 of them interacted with people with disability on a regular basis. And 87% of them had never heard of the show before they started participating in the focus groups. We also have this table about the use of media, which I'll bring back to you later, but it's interesting to look at because not a lot of people used free-to-air TV very often, and that's where this series was shown. And I thought it was really interesting that nobody never used paid services such as Netflix. So every single person, at least sometimes, used a paid service such as Netflix or Stan. So that was interesting. So the focus group themes, they did end up talking about the exact same themes as the interviewers. So we identified these same themes within the focus groups, except for the consistency of communication, because obviously that's a background thing. So I'll touch on all of these. So we've got production goals and the audience. So the focus groups really focused on what it's like to, what the goals of the production was. So they thought that one of the main goals was to normalise diversity. So showing diversity on our screens will help to normalise it. They thought that one of the goals for this series was to show intersectionality and that it would make the talent more relatable. And they felt that gives them dimension. So that was really good. They felt that it would have a wide appeal. So they felt that the goal was that the audience would be everyone. Everyone could watch this show. It was said that it was very easily consumable. However, they did feel like it was aimed towards people with a disability and school students most. That's probably the people that will end up watching this show. And that it's not that attractive to the persuadables. So the people that really need to see this show, it was felt that it wasn't binge-worthy and it's probably something that might turn off people who actually need to hear these things. So we'll talk about the talent a bit. So Chloe went over all of the episodes, but it was interesting to see what the focus groups thought about these episodes. So just as Prue emerged as a clear favourite in the Series 1 focus groups, we found that Jackie was the clear favourite in Series 2. They talked about that this was because she was a complex character with a lot of diversity. She was in a same-sex relationship, she was of mixed race, she had a lot kind of complicated going on for her. Kenny was also perceived as a complex intersectional character, and he was perceived quite well, whereas Oliver was described as somewhat one-dimensional. A bit dry was the quote from one of his focus groups, and there was this general feeling that he was a workaholic and didn't show a lot of work-life balance. So people didn't connect with him quite as much. So navigating inspiration porn was a really big topic, also brought up by the focus groups. I have 2 or 3 slides about this. So they felt that it was interesting because not everyone even agreed on the navigating of inspiration porn. So some of the participants felt that inspiration was a really important thing to show. So there was a quote, I think it's important that deaf people to see someone else that is deaf in a leadership role doing incredible things, because then you look up and identify to people that you identify with. So that was really interesting, that people felt that showing this inspiration was a really important and key part of this. They felt that inspiration porn was navigated through intersectionality, and so having a multi-dimensional intersectional person meant that you saw them not as just a person with a disability, you saw them as a whole person, and so that navigated that inspiration porn trope. However, there was quite a focus on the high achievingness of the individuals. They saw it as a flaw of the series, and there was a concern that if all high achievers, then they don't give an accurate representation of disability. So there was a quote, the trope where if someone with a disability is represented on screen, they have to have some special talent or ability, or they have to be really high achieving, almost to make up for what they are lacking. So that's an interesting point. It was kind of in opposition to the view that the inspiration was important. So we had people on both sides of that argument. However, the focus groups really did see that the Attitude Foundation had really successfully shown that voice and ownership, and they felt that gave the talent agency over their stories. So they felt like that really helped to navigate the inspiration porn. And the intro was brought up quite a few times throughout the focus groups. So there were a few people that picked up that it was a little bit out of place. What is this, a documentary or a true crime series? Was a great quote. So they just felt that it was too gloomy, it used the wrong musics, and it gave you this missing child vibe. So someone said, then if he's a lost child, does that mean if he's a lost child, does that represent how you should feel about him as a person? Is he a lost soul? So that was interesting to see, that people felt like it sets you up to feel like this is going to be really dramatic, and then the whole thing is quite uplifting and inspirational. So employment barriers and supportive environments was a really key aim and goal for Attitude Foundation. So the focus groups brought these up a little bit. They felt like it modelled supportive environments really well, especially in Jackie's case. It showed how she did have a supportive childhood and teachers, and that really set her up to be successful. And then other people didn't have those supportive environments, and so they struggled a lot more. So when someone lives through a supportive environment, it just goes to show what people can succeed if we have a good social structure. But they did feel like there could be more depth in outlining the barriers rather than focusing on the successes. However, they felt like this is a really tricky line to walk because it might come off as pitying. So although they wanted more depth in the barriers, it then falls back into that trope of pity and tragedy. So lots of different things to consider. Platforms was another interesting thing. So the documentary wasn't on a preferred platform, so everyone felt like they're not going to watch free-to-air TV, so when are they going to see this? So they also felt like documentary wasn't what they wanted to be watching, so they wanted more fiction, and they felt like in fiction the navigating of inspiration and inspiration porn is quite a lot easier because it's part of a plot of a multi-dimensional person rather than looked at from an outside perspective. And just if there was going to be fiction, we don't want people without disabilities playing people with disability. And just again, that free-to-air isn't where they're getting their content from. And that's me.
Not back. So this is how our theory of change ended up at the end of the project. You remember at the beginning we had, change attitudes, make a documentary. There are lots of assumptions along the way. So by talking to people involved in production and evaluation, also doing the textual analysis and talking to audiences, we came up with 5 things that needed to happen for the theory of change. And within that, there are a number of other things that need to take place. So first of all, to make a documentary to change social attitudes, you need funding. So this is the first step in achieving this social change, is applying for funding, getting enough funding to do it, but also being funded by an organisation that shares your values about disability and the kinds of stories about disability you want to make. So the Attitude Foundation were funded by the NDIA, and their specific criteria was ordinary life. So they wanted people with disabilities to be represented as having an ordinary life. And within an ordinary life, according to the NDIA, employment's very important. So that is why the Attitude Foundation chose to focus on STEM and STEM employment and sort of the different representations we saw of people being supported in the workplace or people allowing work to take over their lives, maybe a bit too much. So second step is to engage a production company who also shares your values. And what the Attitude Foundation did was engage a production company that focused on disability, and they also employ people with disabilities. That's another one of the micro steps in ensuring change takes place, is employing more people with disabilities in the media. Next step is finding the talent, making sure they're interesting. So, and I think this is the issue with inspiration porn, right, with these kinds of stories. Documentaries are typically about really inspirational people, but we have this legacy of representation when it comes to people with disabilities, that they are represented as being inspirational, for just living their lives. So I think, in fairness to the Attitude Foundation and what they're trying to do, it's actually something really, really difficult. How do you navigate that inspiration porn? And I think, that's something they really reflected on. And as a result, the talent really needed to reflect on as well, which we've got up here as another key point that needs to take place, is the people who are being represented or representing themselves. They need to reflect on what they think is the right type of disability representation that needs to happen. So I think for some of the people that you interviewed, that might have been the first time they'd really reflected on that. I know you had one person point out that everything's a construction in the media, documentary films are a construction, but another person said, no, this is exactly my life. So, really getting these people who are represented or involved in the representation to reflect on what we want as a community, a disability community, how we should represent. We put ourselves up there as a really important micro step, top level step, evaluate the series. So we, as we've talked about through this presentation, we did an in-depth critical disability textual analysis, talked to people in production, people involved in reception. So through that, we were able to really identify different, assumptions and micro steps that we need in order to change disability representation and then change social attitudes towards disability. And so the last step we actually haven't been able to evaluate because, as I said at the beginning, the foundation's in the process of selling this documentary now. They did sell Series 1 to SBS and it got aired at 4:30 in the afternoon and put on SBS On Demand. So we suggested maybe go for some other time slot, for example. If attitudes are going to change, people need to see the documentary. That's a really, really important step. And I understand that they're looking at other avenues for distribution. Came up in the focus groups. People said, what about schools? What about getting to school kids before, their attitudes are fully set in place to give some representations of disability leaders? So that's one avenue they might take. And we thought that this actually brings us back to the first step, is that they might need to apply for some more funding. So, for example, distribution funding, which is also another avenue you can go for. So we've got that kind of hovering over to the side, bringing it all back together. And that's really the project. And I think this template, gives us a good template for representations for other groups as well, not just for people with disabilities. We say representation really impacts people. So to change the way people think, we need to change the representation. But, we found out through this project that it's just not that simple, and it is actually really difficult, to not represent high-achieving people with disabilities actually living ordinary lives in non-inspirational ways. So we do wish Attitude Foundation the best of luck in distributing the series, getting funding for future documentaries that they may want to make. And hopefully we do see some ordinary lives. I suggested to them, maybe have someone trying to catch public transport, things like that. We need to see the way barriers are put in place all through our lives. So thank you.
Thank you, guys. So we're going to open up to questions shortly. So I just wanted to round off by saying that this is actually quite a big project that we were given quite a short amount of time to complete. And what you see here in the team is the combination that we've put together in terms of using staff from Internet Studies, also bringing in RAs who have other experiences. So all those beautiful diagrams you saw, Jordan put them together, design background. And also we've got Chloe coming in as an honours student. So where we've got, we look at production, we look at the text, and we look at the reception. So Chloe's sort of project looked at the text, and so did Robin. So Robin is not here today. So one of the things that Katie ended on was the fact that, what other ways can we get this out there? So Robin basically looked at, what role social media played and what possibilities are there to get something like this out, whether we break it down into bites, put it out there to draw people into the bigger story. So it's been great in terms of having all the different people come together and work together on this project. So that was one of the ways in which we looked at representation, and also having Chloe look at other things like other documentaries and other factors, because one of the other things that the focus group looked at, which Jordan included in the survey, is what are the representations of disability? Do you remember? How does it come across? And also realizing that this is one aspect of it, and that people's exposure to media includes other representations. And as Katie said, it's really hard to try and change representation, but this is a good start. So, questions?